In May 1945, the war that had ravaged Europe for 5.5 years was finally drawing to an end. Of all the Allies, only Britain had fought from the start to the bitter end, and the country was exhausted but still battling. In Europe, whole cities had been destroyed, and 32.5 million men, women and children were dead. So when the complete surrender of German forces was announced on the 8th of May 1945, Winston Churchill's measured address unleashed a wave of celebration and relief.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday the 8th of May. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing.
And they stopped the music right in the middle of a tune and said, V has been declared. And everybody started kissing everybody else. I've never been kissed so many times in one evening.
Champagne produced beautiful girls.
For so many years, one had control one's emotions, and then suddenly it was all over. And the control went.
But few of those celebrating knew the truth behind the end of the war in Europe, the part played by Nazi intransigence and by the continued fighting and mayhem of disintegrating borders. Nor did they fully realise the price that was to be paid for victory in Europe. In the final dark days of the Second World War in Europe, there lies a hidden history. A tale of confusion, chaos and misunderstanding, of many thousands of wasted lives, and of tragedy amidst the rejoicing. It's also a tale of 2 final surrenders, and of not 1, but 3 days of victory. In this film, we're going to explore the events of those momentous last days of the war. In Britain, people were anxiously following the news, waiting with bated breath for the end they felt must surely come at any minute.
It was in the air and everybody was on edge. We were waiting, just waiting for that moment when they said, the war is over.
The horrible feeling that every day that passed, more people, more of our people would get killed, and you just longed for it to end. And everyone was impatient, waiting for that time.
As early as January 1943, the Allies had agreed that they would accept only unconditional surrender from Germany and nothing less. And the map of post-war Europe that was drawn up at the Yalta Conference of February 1945 allowed the Russians to take Berlin. By late April 1945, German resistance on all fronts was collapsing. Caught between a pincer movement by the Allies, only the futile insistence of their Führer prevented German troops surrendering. The net was closing in. In the west, the Allies had crossed the Rhine, encountering little resistance.
They are on the ground. They are beyond the Rhine. With one terrific blow, they have begun the last great battle in the west.
Once we crossed the Rhine, Montgomery said that we would travel 60 kilometres a day. So the tanks rushed through 60 kilometres. We went with them, and then we stopped. And then the lowered infantry come up behind and cleared what we left behind, what we broke through. And after that, there was no contact, really.
They have a rendezvous to keep with the Red Army, and they intend to be on time.
Whilst the Western Allies advanced from the south and west, the Russians had sighed through Poland and Eastern Europe and had launched a brutal attack on Berlin itself, a city already reduced to rubble by British and American bombers. Ignoring the opportunity to flee, Hitler had remained in Berlin, gone to ground near what is now a kindergarten. As the fighting had drawn ever closer, so he had remained cloistered in his underground bunker, demented and raving, his grasp on reality slipping away as quickly as the Russians were now swarming over the ruins above. On April the 30th, realizing his dream of a 1,000-year Reich was over, he shot himself in the mouth. The news was announced on German radio late on May the 1st, but soldiers like Siegfried Thon no longer cared what was happening to the Nazi high command. They were simply fighting for survival, desperate to escape from the notoriously merciless Soviet army. In May 1945, 16-year-old Siegfried was defending this bridge against the Russians.
Genau hier stand der Panzer. Hier stand der Panzer.
So Russian tanks here saw him and fired a shell at him. And the splinters, the shrapnel from the shell, wounded him here in his shoulder, in his leg.
7 Splitter.
7 pieces of shrapnel in him.
Das haben wir hier erfahren. Ja? Wir wollten aus Berlin raus. Wir wollten auf alle Fälle aus Berlin raus zu den Amerikanern kommen. Ja? Das war uns egal zu dem Zeitpunkt.
He was saying that he was here, still here under this bridge when the news filtered through that Hitler had killed himself. And I wondered what his thoughts were about that, and he said he wasn't the slightest bit bothered. It was all the same to him, one way or the other. All he was concerned about at this point was getting as far away as he could out of Berlin and to the safety of the Western Allies. There had been no quarter given in the long and bloody Eastern campaign. The Russians had slaughtered and pillaged their way to the capital, and around 2 million German women had been raped. By the time the Russian army had overrun Berlin, they had lost 300,000 of their men. The German troops were justifiably terrified of retribution. In April 1945, Sam Bradshaw was a 24-year-old tank man fighting in Germany, and well remembers German fear of the Russians.
I talked to a German lieutenant, and he broke down in tears. He was quite a nice fellow. I liked the fellow, actually. And he'd been with the Panzer Regiment, so I had an affinity with him because I was Panzer. And I was talking to him, and he said that when he was taken prisoner by the Russians, they took his boots off and made him march in the snow. And I thought that was, to me, that was degrading to do that to a man.
This fear of Russian brutality was to dominate negotiations right up to the end of the war. The German High Command was desperate to surrender as many troops as possible to the Western Allies, rather than fall into the clutches of the Soviet forces.
Nur bei meiner Gefangennahme. Da habe ich gemerkt, dass wir praktisch einen Ritterkreuzträger, nur weil das Ritterkreuzzug erschossen haben.
Siegfried, he'd just been captured, and there was a soldier near to him in the rank. They were all lined up, and this German soldier was wearing the Knight's Cross. And because he was doing so, the Russian guards dragged this man out and shot him right in front of Siegfried. On May the 3rd, German delegates reached Field Marshal Montgomery's headquarters at Lüneburg Heath in northern Germany, offering to surrender the 3 remaining armies now facing the Russians. Monty refused, telling them that any forces opposite the Russians must surrender to them alone. A day later, the German delegation was back.
Now, we've assembled here today to accept the surrender terms which have been made with a delegation from the German army.
But the German generals only surrendered those troops facing Montgomery in Denmark, Holland and northwest Germany. Those facing the Russians on the Eastern Front would fight on. And whilst these piecemeal surrenders hastened the end, for those at home in Britain there was a growing sense of frustration. When would they hear that the war was over for good?
There were newsreels and radio reports that the Germans were surrendering in thousands. That were when they were into Germany and crossed the Rhine, and it would only be a matter of time.
We were coming to the end of the war and the morale stayed high, and we were expecting the end of the war, and we were hanging about. Stayed in for a day on leave, waiting for this announcement that didn't come.
And so on May the 5th, under leaden skies, Britain waited in vain for word that the war was over, the unpredictable weather contributing to the subdued atmosphere that had taken hold of the country. What people weren't to know was that the Germans were desperately playing for time, hoping that with each hour that passed, more troops would flee west. But in doing so, they were jeopardizing a swift and peaceful conclusion to the war. By May the 5th, 1945, it was clear that Germany had been irrevocably crushed by the Allies. With her cities in ruins and armed forces shattered, the Third Reich was finished. However, fear of Soviet revenge for the atrocities committed during the Nazi invasion of Russia ensured the war continued. Better to fight on, the Nazis reasoned, than to fall into the hands of the merciless Red Army. At Allied Supreme Headquarters in Reims, they were readying themselves for talks as early as May the 4th, when General Eisenhower had been contacted by the Nazi High Command. But if the Germans had thought the Supreme Commander was open to negotiation, they were very much mistaken. Eisenhower had told his staff there could be no bargaining whatsoever. Unconditional surrender of all forces were the only terms he was willing to accept. A German delegation led by Admiral von Friedeberg had been due to reach Supreme Headquarters early on May the 5th, but was delayed by bad weather. When talks eventually began later that evening, von Friedeberg confessed he didn't have the authority to sign any surrender. Talks were postponed until General Jodl, the German Chief of Staff, could reach Reims. Billy Drake, a celebrated fighter pilot now based at Supreme Headquarters, saw Jodl arrive at around 6 o'clock on May the 6th.
I was actually in Eisenhower's headquarters when these two officers walked in and gave Hitler's salute. And Eisenhower turned around to Beadle Smith, who was his deputy, and said, "Would you inform those officers that they are to give a proper military salute?" And ask them to leave and come in and give a proper salute. So they went out there and came and gave Ike a proper salute.
Eisenhower's strong stand shocked the Nazis. Jodl suggested an immediate ceasefire, but wanted free movement of troops for a further 2 days.
We were all prepared and waited up in the war room all that evening, having cups of tea and biscuits and things.
Only when Eisenhower threatened to call off the talks did Dönitz finally give Jodl the authority to sign the unconditional surrender, witnessed by the Russians in the early hours of May the 7th.
General Jodl signs the surrender at 0241 hours. On behalf of the Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, Lieutenant General Smith affixes his signature to the surrender document.
The ceremony over, Jodl stood and lectured the Allied commanders, telling them that as no nation had achieved nor suffered as much as Germany, they deserved to be treated with generosity by the Allied victors. His outrageous claims were dismissed.
The Allied force, which invaded Europe on June 6, 1944, has, with its great Russian allies and forces advancing from the south, utterly defeated the Germans by land, sea, and air.
But despite the momentous nature of events, for those taking part there were to be no great celebrations, rather just a sense of anticlimax.
It was just a part of the day's work. And one couldn't feel any euphoria that one's war was over, because at the back of one's mind you still had these two conflicting aspects, that there's still a war going on in the Pacific, and that there was your own private life to be resolved, what were you going to do.
One of the reasons for such restraint was that upon Stalin's insistence, the news was to be kept secret until 1 minute past midnight on May the 9th. The Soviet leader was furious that despite the surrender, German troops were still fighting in Prague and along the Eastern Front. And despite the surrender terms, throughout May the 7th, thousands of German troops and civilians were still trying to cross the River Elbe into the safety of British and American lines. After the war, the far bank of the Elbe would be part of the Soviet Empire, and the nearer bank would be in West Germany. Where I'm standing now is where the Americans were. Over there in that thick line of trees underneath the bridge was where the Russians were, and they were firing tank and mortar shells straight into the thousands of German civilians and soldiers that were desperate to flee over the bridge to the safety of the Americans. Their only route was a narrow catwalk across the ruined Tangermunde Bridge. Many simply jumped in the river, where a lot died. It was a scene of utter chaos and horror.
As Nazism crumbled, so a once proud and mighty nation experienced the traumatic and tragic reality of defeat. Germany was paying for its terrible folly.
The surrendered German army, they were dreadfully shabby, smelly, miserable-looking people, utterly different from those strutting stormtroopers one had seen at the Nuremberg rallies on newsreels.
But since the remnants of the German armies were still on the move, Stalin insisted there should be no simultaneous victory announcement until May the 9th, 2 whole days after the signing at Reims. Back in Britain, people were bracing themselves for the end of the fighting. Bobby Brown was working in the Foreign Office in London and was hoping for news of her fiancé, missing after a bombing mission. She's kept a letter she wrote to him, but never sent.
The news tonight is so wonderful that I feel thoroughly worked up, and an incredible mixture of emotions seem to be running through me, making me feel one moment like rushing outside and shouting to the world that the war is nearly over, and the next moment I want only to be left alone to weep. Ready?
Not only was she hoping for word of her fiancé, she was also trying to make sense of the rumours she was hearing. Like the rest of Britain, she had been told that the war was nearly over many times before.
There had been so many other horrendous things which had happened when we thought things were going well. And you knew, of course, of a lot of people who were not going to come back because you'd already heard that they were killed. So you had to be very realistic. We knew that everything depended on whatever it was that was being planned, and we only knew the fraction of it.
Neither she nor the rest of Britain could know the surrender had already been signed. Even journalists who'd witnessed the signing were under strict orders to keep the news secret.
They were told, sorry chaps, can't break the story now, you'll have to wait till we say you can.
But in a final blow to Allied pride, it was the Germans who broke the story at 2:27 p.m. on May the 7th. It was too great a temptation for one reporter who'd witnessed the signing.
The Associated Press agency correspondent, Ed Kennedy, a tough American, said, to hell with this. This is the biggest story of my life. I'm not going to hang around for politicians. And he broke the news alone.
Kennedy's story was immediately flashed around the world, and at 9:30 Eastern Standard Time, New York was told of victory in Europe. The celebrations were spontaneous and euphoric. Back in Britain that afternoon, crowds began gathering in cities up and down the country, waiting for an announcement from the Prime Minister. What they weren't to know was that Stalin was still vetoing any official statement.
No one was more frustrated than Churchill, but despite repeated pleading with both Stalin and President Truman, he was unable to get his way. The whole world, it seemed, knew that the war in Europe was over, and yet the furious Prime Minister was forced to cancel not one, but 2 planned victory broadcasts.
Finally, after cancelling a 3rd broadcast on the evening of May the 7th, Churchill decided the British people could wait no longer. They had to be told something. Defying Stalin, he ordered a statement on the BBC. At 7:40 p.m, listeners around the country were told that the following day, May the 8th, was to be treated as Victory in Europe Day. Peter Shaw was a squadron leader in Bomber Command and was due to fly a combat mission that night.
I had sent the boys off on a daylight, and I wandered up to the officers' mess, which was completely empty, and sat down in an easy chair, and a strange feeling, because normally it was just full of shouting idiots, when there was a pip, pip, pip on the wireless, and it said, "The war in Europe is over." And I sat there and I thought, have I gone crazy? And when the boys came back, I told them the news, the war's over. And as a result of which, we all went up to the mess, and no doubt I can't remember anything about it at all, because I was probably blind drunk, but we must have had a pretty good party.
So although Britain had been told to wait until 3 p.m. the next day for an official announcement, the relief was immediate.
I went to bed that night thinking, everybody that I know, everybody who's alive at this moment is going to be alive tomorrow morning.
And when the celebrations did begin, the Prime Minister would be the star.
It was Churchill who'd stood firm during the dark days of 1940 and who'd led Britain through the long, bitter years of war. May the 8th was the day in which the British people would demonstrate their thanks, recognising the unique role he'd played in ensuring ultimate victory.
On May the 7th, Britain had gone to bed knowing that the next day would be VE Day. It had taken 5.5 years, but victory was theirs. All that remained was to hear the Prime Minister tell them officially that the fighting was finally over.
And so Victory in Europe Day finally dawned. The previous evening, the British public had been told the weather forecast for the first time since the beginning of the war. And as promised, they woke on May the 8th to a glorious summer's day, with just the faintest of breezes and barely a cloud in the sky.
Up and down the country, church bells rang out, and people began preparing for the celebrations, many anxiously waiting to hear Churchill's victory broadcast at 3 o'clock that afternoon. For Londoners, there was only one place to be, the very heart of the capital. James Roffey was a 14-year-old boy at home in Camberwell when he heard the news.
We'd got the radio on, and then suddenly it was announced, that's it, it's over. And I was in our living room, and I think my mother was in the kitchen, and I shouted to her, it's over, that's over. And she came running through and said, well, that's it, we're going up the West End.
But from the start of VE Day, the West End was jammed with celebrating Londoners.
The crowds were so dense, the bus couldn't get any further.
Couldn't get up Whitehall?
Impossible to get up Whitehall. This was one sea of people.
And what was the mood on the bus? I mean, everyone must have been very excited.
Everybody was absolutely delighted. You know, people were. Everybody was smiling at each other and talking to each other, which you don't normally do. And then looking at the crowds from the bus, everybody was laughing and joking and cheering, and there were all these impromptu conga lines, and the Cockneys, of course, knees up Mother Brown, and impromptu sing-songs.
The capital and her people had suffered through the long years of war, but at last, on this day at least, London could let off steam.
And remember, we got up here, and of course we're coming up to Trafalgar Square now, and the crowds there all climbing up on Nelson's column, and it was this wonderful feeling of relief, sense of relief. It's over, we've survived, we've got through it.
And it was this sense of relief above all that swept over the nation. The war in Europe was over, and the dark shadow of Nazism had been wiped from the face of the earth. Tom Pocock was a young war correspondent, briefly back from Germany.
In the afternoon, I got in touch with a cousin of mine who'd been invited to a party by a guards officer he'd met in hospital. Why didn't I go with him? And I said, fine, where shall I meet you? And he said, St. James's Palace. Champagne was produced, beautiful girls. And we were having a lovely time that afternoon. And then somebody said, why don't we all go out and carry on the party in Green Park near the palace? And my memories from here on become slightly hazier, because I remember lying on my back with looking up at the leaves of the trees and the blue sky, and hearing all the cheering going on, my head on a silken lap of a charming young woman who was gently pouring champagne from the bottle into my open mouth.
At 3 o'clock on May the 8th, Churchill gave his long-awaited victory broadcast.
At 2:41 a.m., at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied Expeditionary Force.
Churchill's voice was heard not just in Britain, but all over the free world. After addressing the Commons, he suggested the members process across the road to St Margaret's Church to give thanks for the country's victory and to pray for the struggle still to come. Joan Collins was at home on leave in Bradford.
And I was at a dance, and they stopped the music right in the middle of a tune and said, V has been declared. And everybody started kissing everybody else. I've never been kissed so many times in one evening. And I suddenly wanted to be with my mum.
It was coming, it was in the air, and everybody was on edge. We were waiting, just waiting for that moment when they said, the war is over. And I can remember hearing Churchill's speech.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May.
And then my mother and my sister, because my brother was away in Germany, we went down into Bradford, into Town Hall Square, and of course they were all celebrating there. Everybody was dancing and everybody was hugging everybody. It was lovely. And we stayed there till about, I think it was about 10 o'clock at night.
In Bradford Central Square, people gathered to listen to bands and to dance. Back in London, James Roffey had been fighting his way down the Mall through the crowds.
Absolutely jam-packed with people, not just where we're walking, right across the Mall, over the other side, these greens, crowded with people. I remember my mother saying, come on, keep going, because we're inching our way through. That's Buckingham Palace down there, which was probably the first time I'd ever seen Buckingham Palace.
He was desperate for a glimpse of the royal family.
Yeah, I think it was about here where we managed to get to the railings. Yeah. And so, of course, that's where we were and that's where we were staying, and nobody was going to move us.
And you were pressing your face against these railings?
I was up on these. I was up here. I was up on here like this, you know, and we all shouted, we want the king, we want the king. And the royal family kept coming out onto that balcony. We suddenly heard more cheering coming from that direction, and what's going on there? And then I could just see mounted policemen high up on their horses, and they were gently making their way through, clearing a way through the crowd for Churchill. And then when he got to come past here, that's when we saw him. There he was in this big open limo, and standing up in the back of the car with his cigar on, beaming all over his face, of course, enjoying every minute of it. And the King stepped back and led Churchill out, and the noise then of the cheering, it was fantastic. And of course, he stood there giving his victory sign.
As the day wore on, there was no sign of an end to the partying.
We then got up unsteadily and joined the crowds. And as the afternoon turned into evening, dancing got going, knees up Mother Brown. You would see a naval captain arm in arm with a pearly queen, a coster, cockney, dancing around. It was absolutely wonderful. Very, very exciting.
All over Britain, people gave themselves over to dancing and celebrating, the hardships and shortages of the war briefly forgotten.
In Bradford, as elsewhere, the relief was palpable. Here in Central Square, crowds gathered on VE Day, cavorting and dancing with wild excitement. And for the children, the greatest treat of all, hastily organised street parties with the kind of food they had only dreamed about for years.
There was lots of food and we didn't know where it came from actually. It just seemed to appear like magic, and of course we thought this was wonderful, you know, all these sandwiches and jellies and cakes and things.
Well, I remember because I was 11 when it was over, and there were just children screaming and shouting, you know how they do, and play extra games and act silly. It was really exciting time, and of course when we had the street parties, that was brilliant.
Another good thing that was good was when the blackout was shocking, but that night when you could switch, when the street lights came on again, that was another wonderful time. You know, everybody waiting for it to get dusk and the lights all came on.
But for some people, VE Day provoked different feelings. Joy was mixed with thoughts of the dead and missing. At first, Bobby Brown wanted to be part of the celebrations.
I came in by tube and found my way through the thousands of crowds, and took my place. I waited for the royal family to come out. And then, because of my own personal story, I couldn't cope anymore. And I just sort of fought my way back through the crowds.
She was not alone in her feelings. Many who had lost loved ones found it hard to share the celebrations.
For so many years, one had to control one's emotions. And then suddenly it was all over. And the control went. The extra poignancy for me, I still thought that maybe by the time I got back to my parents at the bungalow in Mill Hill, my fiancé just might be one of the ones who'd been freed.
For others, it was still not quite the end in Europe. There was even one part of the British Isles that remained under German occupation. And in Berlin, there was a further surrender to be signed before victory in Europe was finally and indisputably declared. Whilst the rest of the country celebrated, the only part of the British Isles to be occupied by Germany was still waiting to be liberated after nearly 5 years of Nazi rule. 2 British destroyers were on their way, but had yet to reach the Channel Islands.
We knew that it was going to come, but just when, you know, and everybody was so impatient. I think I can remember, you know, Mum and Dad and everybody were talking about it. When is it going to happen and when are they going to come? We just couldn't wait.
The 8th of May must have seemed very strange to many of the islanders. Word had reached them that the war was over and that afternoon Winston Churchill would be making his victory broadcast. And yet they remained an occupied island. The Germans were still there, and not a single British soldier had reached their shores.
We didn't know that these boats were outside, but it was overnight. You know, you kept thinking, well, somebody's coming tomorrow morning. I mean, the boats has to come.
Molly Behay had remained on Guernsey throughout the war. In May 1945, she was 14 and remembers listening to Churchill's speech on a radio that had been hidden from the Germans.
A friend of ours, neighbours, had this little radio hidden in a cushion in the chairs. And he got it out and put it on the windowsill upstairs. I can see it now. And we all got in the road listening.
The ceasefire began yesterday to be sounded all along the front. And our dear Channel Islands are also to be freed today.
Of course, we all went a bit mad when Churchill said, our dear Channel Islands will be free. And Germans were passing along the road and they just didn't take the slightest bit of notice. They were just walking by as normal.
But although by 3 o'clock on May the 8th, the islanders knew they were to be liberated, they were still officially under German occupation. Germany itself had been overrun by nearly 1 million Allied troops, but for most of them, VE Day was just a brief respite in their duties. Rifleman Bernard Hickmott, a former groom, managed to get hold of a horse and trap.
And as I say, this was VE Day. We said, right, we'll go out on a ride. So we saddled up, got the old buggy and off we went fishing. We had no beer or nothing. There's no drinking up or anything like this, but we danced around and, being happy. Nobody firing guns like that, nothing. It was just ordinary soldiers. We finished, like finishing exercise. It was finished, and we went into the rooms or to the houses that we were, and the Germans celebrated too, because they'd heard the news and they were crying and the kids were screaming. We had our compo rations, 24-hour ration packs, and in them were the acid drops and the old sweets, and we were lobbing them out to the kids. They lapped it up,
For most Allied troops, however, May the 8th was just another day. Sam Bradshaw, now camped in northern Germany, remembers little euphoria.
We didn't celebrate. We knew that they were celebrating in England. I felt personally a resentment that I wasn't there to participate, that I felt that I'd done my best. And the people with me, all the soldiers with me, were all in the same boat. And we thought, well, why are they're celebrating? And we have nothing to celebrate, really. The war for us only ended on paper. There was a job to be done, a terrible job.
As liberating troops swept through Europe, they were confronted with the terrible legacy of the Nazis, the concentration and extermination camps.
At the end of the war, I was encamped in a small camp near Belsen, and I went for a walk, and when I walked, I became quite emotional, actually. I even came to tears. I must admit that I saw the shoes of women and children and men, and suitcases, spectacles, thousands and thousands, and I realised that each pair of shoes represented a person, and particularly the children's shoes. This to me was overwhelming, and I walked around the camp and went back to my billet, and I sat down and wrote a letter home to my mother. How awful, thought I, that by merely being a human being, I had something in common with the German people. But I found consolation in the thought that I'd played my part in helping to destroy those who had preached and upheld this doctrine of bestiality.
What he saw made him question his 5 years of fighting in North Africa and Europe.
I felt angry and a feeling of failure, that we'd failed in spite of all we'd done in the war and the comrades had lost and what we'd achieved. In spite of everything, we'd failed to stop this terrible thing happening.
As those responsible for the camps were being rounded up, journalists were brought in to tell the world the truth about the Nazis' terrible legacy.
You went in there and you looked around the horrifying scene with these wretched prisoners tottering about, grave pits, and there's a stack of corpses waiting to be thrown in. And there was a frightful smell outside the crematorium, and it was really very horrible. And they were, at that time, moving the prisoners out of the prison huts, where they were full of typhus. And as soon as they moved prisoners out of a row of huts, they burnt them down with flamethrowers. There, I took that picture. That's one of the huts going up in flames.
British flame tanks fire the flimsy buildings. Belsen is erased from the earth. Buchenwald, Dachau, Nordhausen, Belsen.
Even as Britain and America celebrated VE Day, there was still one final act to be played out on May the 8th. Stalin was insisting on a ratification of the final surrender agreed the day before, and where better than Berlin, the shattered heart of the Third Reich. A defiant but humiliated Field Marshal Keitel was driven through the decimated remains of Berlin to Marshal Zhukov's headquarters in the south of the city.
According to Zhukov, Keitel had been extremely shaken by his journey through Berlin, and on his arrival here at Karlshorst had admitted to his captors that he'd been terrified by the extent of destruction. "Mr. Field Marshal," replied one of the Russian officers, "were you not terrified when, on your orders, thousands of Soviet towns and villages were wiped off the face of the earth, and millions of our people, including many thousands of children, were buried under their ruins?" Keitel had no reply.
Throughout the Soviet era of East Germany, This room was preserved as a lasting symbol of their triumph. The Russians were determined that this surrender would not be the low-key affair that had taken place at Reims. The room was packed with triumphant Soviet officers, press and camera crews. At around 11 p.m, the ceremony began.
The Germans were brought here, to this table. Keitel sat in this chair, stiff-backed and defiant, but clearly uneasy. Tedder eyed him and said, "Have you read this document on unconditional surrender? Are you prepared to sign?" Keitel icily looked back and said, "I am prepared to sign," then removed his right glove and adjusted his monocle.
The German signatures represented the final act in the fall of the monstrous Third Reich. At last, the Soviets could celebrate the end of the Great Patriotic War, a truly terrible struggle that had cost a staggering 20 million Russian lives. The news of victory was finally broadcast in Russia in the early hours of the morning, and VE Day celebrated that day 24 hours after Britain and America. On May the 9th, the Russians celebrated their victory under the watchful eye of their leader, Joseph Stalin. After the war, much of Germany and Eastern Europe would fly the flag of communism and oppression for a further 45 years. As midnight on May the 8th passed and the war was officially over on all fronts, 2 British destroyers waiting off the Channel Islands closed into the shore. At 7:45 on the morning of May the 9th, 20 British soldiers stepped ashore at St. Peter Port.
And then all of a sudden we saw these little figures sort of right at the end down at the pier. And this is them, you know. And of course the excitement was just swelling up in everybody. And just waited. We couldn't come fast enough, and they were marching so smartly. They had the bayonets. There they were coming. We just pushed our constables out the way, and we just ran like mad. And of course when we got to them, it was a case of everybody went mad. We were loving them and kissing them and knocking their hats off, and they were crying as well as us. We were absolutely, you know, it was such a wonderful moment.
While the German garrison handed over their weapons, the British soldiers formed up outside the old courthouse and hoisted the Union flag. For most Channel Islanders, this was the moment of liberation on the morning of May the 9th.
It must have been later in the day when the sailor came, and again more loving and more cuddling, and he said to me, "You're a bit young, Missy." He said, "I'll come back to you in a few years' time."
The celebrations were soon over. New hardships lay ahead. Britain's noble struggle had left her on the brink of collapse, and those who had survived were now forced to reflect on what life held in store after the war.
We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. But let us not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead. Japan, with all her treachery and greed, remains unsubdued.
Despite scenes of euphoria and rejoicing, for many, VE Day was marked by grief for those who would not be returning home. People were also genuinely anxious about the future. 60 years on, we know that victory in the East was just a few short months away. But in May 1945, few dared believe that was possible.
The war was obviously over. We'd done our stuff. So what? It still had the actual overall war was still on. The Pacific War had still to be won.
I found that my experience when I first went home was that I couldn't adjust, and I didn't feel I belonged at home anymore. I'd become too remote from civilian life with the war, and the war for me was really, being a soldier, a combat soldier, was really my life. and there was no place for me.
Huge numbers of people by then would have known that their loved ones, their fathers, their sons, their lovers, their whatever, were dead, and that was easier. It was horrendous, but it was easier.